Just hit this. So sorry about the whole time mix up there. I freaked out when I saw you emailed me there.
No, it was all good.
Yeah. So what time is it where you are?
Right now it's 9 o'clock.
Oh, okay. So you're later.
Yeah, I was 2 hours off because I went one down instead of one up.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, yeah. I said this won't be 4 hours like
Oh man, yeah. Yeah, that was something else.
Yeah, it was good. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I followed probably 75% of it, but
Yeah. Well, and that was actually, I was kind of saying that from the word go. I kind of wanted to have a conversation with him where we could go deeper than other people have been able to go with him.
Yeah.
As I reflect back on that conversation as well, I re-examined a couple of things, and there was a couple of points that he took as givens that I don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, we can get into some other stuff, but yeah, like there's some pretty predominant Jewish scholars who have done a lot of work on the text who would not say that certain things that he said couldn't be an interpretation. They would say certainly could.
Mm-hmm.
And they would even be within Orthodox Judaism. It's not just some Christian saying it, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, and all other things that he positioned as givens, when I looked into them, I was like, it's actually a little less secure than you may have thought. I mean, yeah, I still felt it was a pretty good conversation. Yeah, and I find Jacob's material very interesting.
Yeah, I haven't watched too much of it, but well, like I don't know, I did see like he had the one where about John Calvin is a murderer or whatever, and I was like, well, this is a little unnuanced, but I mean,
yeah.
But so
should we do an introduction before we start anything?
Sure.
Heard you recording.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So Dave, you now famous now from Chris's channel and from Jacob's channel, but I guess. Are you putting out any of your own material or anything yet, or?
I made one video that I mean, if people want to track down, you just look up Fully Alive, which I did one video that I feel still holds up pretty well, where I'm just talking. It's more so it's a video essay about right now. I've had ideas for other ones, but we'll see. I want to do things that require a lot of editing and more formal, like tight essays is what I'm most interested in. And that requires a lot of work. So instead, I just end up doing this. I also did an interview with Emily, Mud Hut Illustrations. So whenever she starts her YouTube channel, and conversation I had with her will be coming up as well.
Yeah, this was like a weird, I mean, I don't know. Do you watch, I mean, like how did you kind of get involved with this whole little corner, as they say?
Yeah, they all say that, by the way. I haven't heard the expression "this corner of the internet" until I started hanging out in this corner of the internet.
Right.
That's like that's the unifying thing. Everyone says this corner of the internet. So I started listening to Peterson before he became popular. Actually, I had a friend who was into him like since early 2000s. So a friend had sent me some of his lectures, and then from there I started watching a lot of Petkau, and some Paul Vanderklay, and then through that there was recommendations for Chris's channel, and some of the things that Chris has done I really liked. I like a couple of his songs. I like a lot of his interviews, and I liked what he was doing as far as editing other people's work to get at the core of something. which sometimes it takes a while to get there for his ability to reduce that stuff down. And then I was listening to one conversation, and it was just the arts group hanging out one Wednesday, and I had some ideas on what they were talking about because it was Exodus, and I have spent a lot of time in Exodus. So I think I contacted Emily first, and then because she was asking for those invitations, and then was talking to Chris as well, and then spoke with them through that. So kind of saw those conversations, found them interesting, and felt I could possibly contribute to it because I have a perspective that I don't think is entirely common. Basically, whenever I have a conversation with someone at a new church, they kind of go, "I've never heard that before." So that's kind of part of my entry into it.
That's cool. So like, what is your a Bible study methodology, or more or less, or how are you kind of, because I mean obviously you've gone really far into the more Hebrew roots of things, and I know you've
So there is a movement, by the way, called the Hebrew Roots Movement, which I have no association with. Okay. I don't even know if I've encountered any of their material. My entry point into it really was, I grew up Catholic. I grew up Catholic atheist. I became a believer while attending what's called a Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in my hometown of Windsor, Ontario, which is right across from Detroit. So I became a Christian in my first year of university, the same time everyone else is leaving the church. Is exactly when I got into it. And I did 1 year just raising up money for Bible college. And while I was doing that, I was attending a lot of churches. And then because I grew up Catholic, we would do a Lord's Supper special service, Holy Thursday. And so we met on Thursday for my college and career group. So I said, "Oh, we should do this thing." And my youth pastor said, "Well, look into it, find out whatever you find out, and then we'll do it." So I looked into it, and when I did, I came to some unexpected conclusions, shall we say, which was basically this very deep rabbit hole of Jewish traditions that I started thinking that Christians should participate in. Or more than that, that it seems implied and sometimes outright stated that the early church continued to practice these things. And that when you understand those patterns, it becomes a lot more clear how ideas are being worked through the Bible and how the Bible is one single story. So I really liked a lot of Pajot's material, but one of the things that I didn't like is all of his traditions are first century, are not first century. I would say the Orthodox and Catholic traditions claim to be older than they actually are. So I think that there's a lot that can be learned from these traditions. And the other thing is that my big dream is that the Christian denominations could actually be unified through realizing these traditions. That basically we have not had, because of the conversation that is occurring right now between the synagogue and the church, which really has not existed for 2,000 years, which is our own stupid fault. But also there wasn't things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. We weren't able to study what Second Temple Judaism was about. My hope is that we can collectively as a church realize that we had made mistakes, and that could possibly unify denominations to realize, I mean, this might be controversial, but if we know that baptism exists in Judaism and has always existed, that in the time of Christ, that people were getting baptized all the time, then maybe we could ask the question, what does that baptism look like? And then all of the divisions based on baptism, maybe that could be solved, right? Maybe we would just go, okay, that's what it looks like. That's what the tradition looks like. And we're just going to submit to that. And what's great about that is that no one celebrates communion like Passover. So it actually, the bridge could be that we're all wrong, right? If one person was right, if it was just like, oh, we all have to listen to the Catholics, that could cause a lot of issues because that might give people undue authority. Whereas with my idea, no one is doing it. So it could unify because we're all wrong. That could be a very powerful thing. So that's part of my ideas.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, I could kind of tell like some of what you were saying, that you were kind of that like I guess what you were saying, like now we're like living in the time of Josiah again.
Right.
And like, I mean, that's kind of like how I feel. Like, I mean, maybe because I'm more Protestant in my thinking, I've just been thinking about like just the fact of like, now that we have the internet and like we have people from so many different traditions within Christianity and Judaism, just like learning about each other, and it gets rid of a lot of the animosity. And even like where I grew up in New England, and most of the churches there are pretty small, so there already was more like fellowship between churches, because if you wanted to do something like for the town or something, you like had to work with you couldn't just there's no churches that were big enough to like put on a big thing all by themselves. So I think that's kind of that's kind of the thing that's going, and so I'm just more or less thinking about it just in the knowledge base, because I've enjoyed learning a lot more about like the Orthodox thing, and I do kind of feel like I really like what Jonathan Pageau is doing, but I feel like his personal loyalty to like the Orthodox Christianity is kind of it's kind of like a limiting factor on what he's doing, in my opinion,
Right. And there are also questions I have that are bigger regarding, I believe that God can redeem pagan traditions. Right. I think that he's able to do that. There's references, I was kind of getting into this with Jacob, is that one of the terms for Yahweh is the one that rides on the clouds, right? And that's actually a term that is in the Baal cycle, repeatedly used to describe Baal. So when the writers of the Hebrew Bible use that term, what they're doing is they're saying, no, Baal is not God. He's not the cloud rider. Yahweh is, right? That it's kind of like an attack at Baal, telling him that he's not that great, right? So I'm not against Scripture doing that. But the thing is that in my thinking, God actually gave us traditions by which to remember what our relationship with him is supposed to look like, and that the Orthodox traditions and the Catholic traditions are divorced from the Old Testament foundations of what that stuff is about. Like one of the examples that I would use, with all due respect to anyone who's Orthodox who might be listening, I don't think you can properly celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread with leavened bread, right? So Orthodox communion is leavened, right? So if that's a perfect example of something very small that could be like on how we could understand something as part of something bigger that God gave as a tradition, which like there's different feasts. So I'm not even against using leavened bread for communion in specific situations, but that's different from the way that Christ filled up Passover, in my opinion. So that's as an introduction. But anyway, back on my education thing. So I'm going to multiple churches, reading my Bible like crazy. One of those Christian groups is a Messianic group. I come to Toronto which is where I did my BA in religious studies. And I focused very, very intensely on the Old Testament. I basically didn't take anything New Testament. And I also continued being in these circles. I went to synagogue a whole bunch and like learned a lot of what the traditions are. And then from there, like my philosophy was basically, if you understand the Old Testament in depth, the New Testament is not that complicated. Mm-hmm. That was the idea. And I really still think that way. And also a lot of Christians, I feel, are overly focused on Greek and overly focused on Paul. And to me, I focused on Hebrew. And so as I was learning Hebrew, they're doing stuff in the New Testament that are Hebrew word plays, for lack of a better term, that if you know how Hebrew symbolism works, it follows through into the New Testament. Mm. So that was basically the philosophy with which I went through. And then my stuff is, one of my professors, he taught at Yale and a couple of other places, but his name was Stanley Walters. And he put this idea in my head, which was that the text wants to be understood. And so the explanation for the text is in the text itself. Mm. Now, as time has gone on, I do think there's a lot of value in archaeology and all the stuff that comes from first century material. But to me, the core of the text is in the text itself.
Yay. Yeah. It's like, yeah. I know, because I know you had mentioned that you've been, studied some Michael Heiser stuff, and I went down on like the deep, I listened to a lot of that and read most of his books and stuff. And I do, I don't really have any problem with Michael Heiser. I guess this is the problem I have with everybody. It's not the people who like say the things, but it's the people that latch onto those people.
Right.
So, and like, just, I understand, like I understand the like ancient Near East context and some of this stuff, but I almost think like some of these things, when you focus so much on that, on those elements of it, then it's like that's the only thing the text becomes about.
Right.
And it's like, I don't think, I think one of the things, we believe it's an inspired text, it's God speaking. It does have that characteristic that it speaks to all variety of people, and it, it means it, so I don't say that like those elements aren't in it, like, a lot of polemical things, but I mean, especially it's like, I want to say like Genesis 1 and 2, and it's not about creation. I think it is about creation. Not to say those elements aren't in there, but
right.
Well, I mean, all the other mythologies that people are comparing it to they are about creation.
Well, and I do think that one of the things that Heiser is really good at, and part of my interest in a lot of Heiser's material is that, completely unrelated, I'm really into the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know why. I picked it up at a thrift store and read it through, and have read it through so many times at this point. And I started realizing that, especially if you understand how Heiser thinks about some of this stuff, that I would get into conversations with people, and the way that they would dismiss the Bible, I instead was like, oh, this shows the intelligence of the biblical writer, right? In the way that that's one of the things that kind of pisses me off about people who are really big about the second temple material, is they'll be like, look at how this looks exactly like that, right? And they won't notice how radically different it is.
Yeah.
Like, people aren't noticing how radically different the biblical flood account is.
Right.
It's very, very different. And one of the things I find so interesting, I think I even said this when I was speaking with Chris and the rest of the group, is that in all the other ones, there's one God that has this justice or judgment upon the earth. and another God who wants to rescue and has mercy. And in the biblical account, it's one God having to deal with these elements within his being. That he has to, how does he balance those things, right? There's some pretty cool stuff that's going on there, right? So I really like Heiser a lot. I've used him a bit as a gateway into other scholars, into other conversations, but he's a great entry point into scholarly work.
It's interesting because, like, I kind of, like a lot of people or whatever, when all the pandemic stuff happened, I was like, what's going on? Freaking out. And and I was like, and I had gone, like the church I grew up in, my dad's church, it was more of a Reformed church. It was like my parents were super open to like all sorts of, it was well-rounded in the biblical teaching and all that. But I ended up spending a lot of time working at a Pentecostal church and went to a Pentecostal Bible college and stuff. And so, they had all this like demons and all that stuff, but they just, they did it in such a goofy way that I was like, I'm like, I don't know. I think you're kind of blowing this out of proportion a little bit. So I just started kind of doing just like, okay, I'm just going to like go through the Bible for myself without looking at other sources and see what I can figure out about like, what are the like spiritual forces at play in the world, and kind of try to figure things out. And I went through like, I didn't get, I think looking back, I should have, you can't really see so much like angels and demons in the Old Testament because it's depicted as gods and it's all these other gods. So I did miss quite a bit, but
and there's a major assumption as well, which is that you're basically told not by the text, you're told by pastors and stuff that no, it doesn't mean that. Like, you read through the Exodus story.
Well, if you watch the Prince of Egypt, don't study this stuff even, just don't. It's like it's not like, that's like my biggest pet peeve is whenever anybody says like that's not an important question to ask, like specifically about the Bible. I'm like, I'm gonna find out about it then if you're saying it's not important. But so I did all that, and then after I did that, I found Michael Heiser, and I was like, oh, okay, well, right about this, wrong about like the Satan and Job or whatever. It's not like,
I'm still not sold particularly on that one, but that's
honestly, it didn't really matter. Like I was looking at it more even like, what can a demon do, or what can a spirit, a spiritual being that's not God, like what can they do, what can't they do, and trying to figure out like, I think, but what it boils down to is more or less they can communicate to people and they can tell you lies. And if you believe those lies, then that's going to affect you badly. But anyway,
I definitely do think that they can do things. What they can do, that's kind of up for it. But like I had a friend, this is years back before I had even heard of Heiser, and he got into chaos magic, where he was trying to manifest things and like stuff started happening in his life. And I told him, I used to drive into work with him. I gave him warnings and stuff. I didn't say, look, everything that you're engaging in is bullshit. That's not what I said, right? I didn't say, don't go into this because none of it's real. I told him, you don't want to mess with that. Like, if you start like literally it's called chaos magic. So if you start like picking up a phone and dialing random numbers, you don't know who's going to pick up, right? I think the Christian answer for a really long time has been to tell people there's only one phone number that you can call. Right? And I think no, it's one of the most terrifying lines, in my opinion, of Ezekiel, which is, if you come to me with gods set up in your heart, I will answer to you in accordance with those gods. Or I think it might be with those idols, where it's like, you're going to hear what you want to hear. If you have idols in your heart, you're going to get an answer. The most terrifying thing is not that you hear nothing or you hear the one true God. It's no, there's other stuff in there.
Well, yeah,
you're one of them, but yeah.
Well, I think that's definitely the thing is that, I think, and that's the problem is that in discounting these forces, like, or we just think of them as like forces, we don't think of them as like intelligent, that, they have at least as much communication ability as a person, and they're older, so they would be smarter. But, so I think, Western society, they very much are taking advantage of the fact that nobody's, because like my dad actually, he got saved because he watched The Exorcist, and he realized that he was being oppressed by demonic forces. So, like, that's the thing, when they do freaky stuff in people whose mind, whose worldview doesn't allow for freaky stuff, it's gonna tend to, so they can do more damage by just
I don't know if you have noticed some of these things as well. I've dipped my toes into conspiracy theory videos, and it's interesting because multiple people who were interested in some out there topics became Christian. And I don't even want to mention names because I don't support all of their material, but 3 different conspiracy theory guys that I watched, sometimes just for entertainment, not even agreeing with them, they encountered some real demonic stuff.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that they didn't have an encounter with the positive spirits.
Mm-hmm.
They had an encounter with a negative spirit. Like, they encountered a demon. They realized its reality, or they realized that there are people that are using chaos magic. My friend who used chaos magic, it spoilers, backfired. Who could have seen that coming, right? Like seeing this happen in a variety of situations where, like, one was a guy that was doing astral projection or whatever it's called, where he was like going into trance-like states in order to become disembodied in order to see other things. He had a friend verify it, and he was getting into that kind of thing. And then he encountered an entity that was the first time that something could see him. Because in any time he did something like that, no one could see him. And it had very malicious intent towards him. This is how he became a Christian, right?
Yeah.
Like, he was just messing with the other side. I even wonder, there's a passage in the Old Testament that says, a famine is coming, not of bread and water, but of hearing the word of God. And I think that our society has been in the middle of, like, I've been saying we've been in a mental health pandemic for like 4 years at this point, maybe more, right? And I think that we are in a famine period as well, but it's not like, people can't wrap their heads around the possibility that the judgment of God is on us, but that what that looks like is a fuzziness towards our relationship with God. And I really do think something is happening. I don't know what it is. I like saying that it's Josiah's revolution, just like where we've discovered the book of the law again, because it's very, very strange. If you look at, not to get into too much crazy stuff, if you look at people's theories about the end times, if it was older than 70 years, like if you look at material that's World War II and earlier, they all think that the end occurring in Jerusalem is ridiculous, because it's very, very clear that that Israel is a Jewish state in the book of Revelation was like the idea, and in Ezekiel as well. So they're like, yeah, that's not literal, right? Because for the entirety of the church's existence, basically, that couldn't be fulfilled literally. Something radically would have to shift. And for the first time, like, it's very interesting how quickly after Israel is made a state that the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered. and that certain conversations which couldn't happen before appear to be happening. They really do appear to be happening. So, I mean, I'm kind of excited. Even in the stress of COVID, I think people are searching in a way that they never searched before. And so, you know, some pretty terrible things were happening in my life when I first became a Christian. So I see all these things as an opportunity, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I feel like, you know, and that was kind of the, you know, that was like, I never really thought, I heard, you know, the end time stuff, and, you know, especially like in evangelical world, it's like the dispensational kind of left behind sort of thing is like, you know, and even so, like, I go to Bible study on once a week, and like most of the guys in there are just like, this is what's going to happen, here's how it's going to go. And, like, and I'm like, and honestly, I'm like, well, maybe, but the thing is that, like, I just don't understand. I just don't understand how people like can not understand that, like, you have maybe like a couple opposing interpretations of things, and you're just going to decide that the one you like better is the right, like, just like live as if you could be wrong about that. And maybe, you know, because that's the thing I see is like that you know, a lot of the church is like, oh, like that, it's like, we just got to hold on until the rapture. And it's like, okay, well, if that rapture thing is a lie, then you have become incapacitated and of no use to the kingdom of God, because, you know, you're just waiting for that instead of
you mean that perspective that no one had until 200 years ago. And still only Americans. That perspective. I mean, there's a couple of Canadians who have it too. But
I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm like, hey, that's the way. That's great. If I get sucked into, you know, out of here before, you know.
No, I totally get it. Well, it was so strange for me because when I first became a Christian, it was just as, I think the Left Behind books had just finished, or I don't know. But they seem to be pretty prominent. Whereas now it seems like we drifted away from it. And so I was listening to a lot of it, and they were all like, we're all going to get injected with something, and then Russia's going to start World War III. And I remember thinking that was complete BS 12 years ago, right? Or however long, or 15 years ago when I first became a Christian. But that information is still in my head, and I'm like, what was that about, right? And I don't actually think that is what is happening right now. But it's weird because those things are still in my head, where I'm like, I remember someone said something about Russia. It's complete bunk where you get the idea that it's Russia that will start World War III, just to be completely clear. But as I started studying the text more and more, first off, I think it's so funny that if you studied a lot of end times material, you would assume that it was very clear that a rapture happened in Revelation. It's not at all. But the other thing is that very similar to the conversation that I was having before, if you understand Old Testament imagery, it is just a retelling of that story. That's mostly what my conversation with Emily was about. Is I walked her through the imagery in the temple, because if you understand the temple, that's what's happening in the beginning of Revelation and throughout Revelation. When you're walking into the heavenly throne room, you're walking into the temple. That's why there's 7 lights before the throne. That's the menorah. And why there's an altar of incense. That is the altar of incense. Like, it's right there, right? And like, there's a whole bunch of imagery that I think the church has completely lost. And then a recent thing for me is I think the church has seen success as looking like David and not realizing that it's supposed to look like Joseph. And that David, when he was good, also looked like Joseph. When David is a good ruler, when he's a good guy, it is when he is a suffering servant. It's when the evil king is trying to kill him. That is when he does all the good stuff. He he looks like Joseph in that period of time. He looks like he's constantly dying.
Yeah, well, I was even thinking about that because when you were talking with Jacob about, and I had heard about the Messiah Ben Yosef thing from the guy that was on Michael Heiser's podcast. I don't know if you heard that one or not, but Irish guy. But then I was thinking, and as you guys were talking, I was thinking, I'm like, well, like the thing, like David's life, it does, like Christ's life is very similar to David's, but he hasn't there's no coronation yet. So he's been anointed, and then he goes into the wilderness and he's on the run, and there is this span of time between when he's anointed as supposed to be the king and when it actually takes place. So
right.
And I think that that's a and I think that it's interesting too, because so I've just been looking at church history. I keep just going back from the Old Testament, right from the beginning to the time of Christ, and then everything happens still, because our story contains all of that. And I've been kind of seeing because it's very easy for us to say the Catholics are pagans, what are they doing? But when everybody was a pagan, that was the vehicle that God used to reach a lot of those people.
Right. Yeah.
And so there was a time and a place for these things. So now it's kind of because at the point in time when the Catholic Church was covered the whole world, or the whole known world, or the Christian world, then it kind of was I'm sure in some people's mind, putting aside any corruption for the sake of discussion, it was this kind of majestic monarchical vision of this is the kingdom of God, and
Yeah, I don't entirely buy it though, because I think the church gets pretty messed up as soon as it has worldly power. As soon as it's interesting, because I think it inadvertently also follows a biblical pattern, which is the failure of the first, the failure of the first, and that the second is the proper one, right? So Cain and Abel, right, where the older one who should be good. But I think the whole biblical pattern, as a Christian, first Adam is a failure, second Adam is not a failure, right?
Yeah.
Christ as the second Adam is playing into that pattern, right? Where Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, the first set of brothers and Joseph, that is the significance of that. But then as you go through, Saul is the first king, he's a failure. Aaron is the first priest, right? But he's not to partake in in Yom Kippur, because he participated in the production of the golden calf, right? There is a curse that's on Aaron as the first priest for what he did. Saul is the first king, right? All of the firsts are failures.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's the second that ends up taking over. And Rome as an institution, both the East and West agree on this, that for the longest time, Rome was considered to be the first among brothers, right? So you had the top 5 churches, and I can't remember them all. I don't know if I can still do it. Constantinople, Alexandria, Rome, Jerusalem,
Antioch.
Yeah, it might be Antioch.
I think.
Okay, yeah. But the idea was that Rome was first among brothers. So it would actually completely fit the biblical image if the first among brothers was got into some bad stuff. And I grew up very Catholic.
Yeah.
I grew up old school Catholic. And when I was in Malta, which is where my dad was born and grew up, there's like, we were there not too long ago, a couple of years ago, for a feast for Mary, and they had a life-size statue of Mary that they hoist on poles, and they hoist it throughout the town square, and she's covered in jewelry. And my mom says to me that it was well known by me that when I don't think I was born yet, but my uncle, so my dad's brother, got in a terrible car accident, and they didn't know if he was going to survive. Drunk driver got on the wrong way on the highway. Okay, so like hits him head on, and they don't know if my uncle Peter is going to survive. And my nonna makes a promises the Virgin Mary that if she spares my uncle, that she will buy that statue a gold ring. And that statue is still wearing that gold ring to this day. And the statue is covered in jewelry. And my mom told me this story like it was supposed to be such a beauty. Isn't that nice? Right? Because like my dad is an atheist, but my mom is a Catholic. And the whole time as she's explaining this to you, I'm like, my nonna tried to bribe a statue so that God would heal her. Like, think about the image that my nonna had of God, right? Which was, she wants her son healed. And what Jesus's response is no, you buy my mom some jewelry and then we'll talk. Right? Like, think about what that image is, right? And you'd be hard pressed to convince me after the research that I've done that a lot of Catholicism doesn't still have a lot of that paganism in it. And I grew up with it. I think modern Catholicism has lost a lot of it. But I'll tell you what I grew up with, because I grew up with old school Catholicism. I grew up with a lot of statues. We prayed in front of a lot of statues, and
Well, no, I don't. You don't have to convince me that there's a lot of paganism in the Catholic Church. I'm not saying. I'm just saying. What I was just saying is that, I mean, if in the minds of people, because it came out of the pagan worldview, that like, like, I think, now we can think like the kingdom of God is like,
can use it.
That's what I'm saying. Like, now I think, I think that this, it's like this invisible kingdom, and everywhere, I think, there's wheat and tares everywhere.
Well, and after the conversation I had with Isaac, I do think that something that I've added to my perspective is this idea that what if the point of the empire of Catholicism is that it spreads the gospel like crazy, a pagan version of the gospel, but it spreads it in ways that it was never going to be spread if that didn't happen. And then it required, not in its empire to save the world, but in its death to save the world, in the destruction of the organized church. In that, something is bubbling up that's incredible, right? But that the first thing fails, which also I've been wondering about, like this image of the first failure. Like, I don't know to what extent you saw it in the conversation I was having with Jacob. I see Genesis as having an introduction, and then it goes from after the fall to the end of the book is like one section. And the beginning is asking a question. And that question is, how could Abel be the hero if Cain is there also? How could that possibly be the case? And it's not through human ability, but through God getting into the story and working with even the evil decisions of human beings. He, like, the answer to that question is Joseph. It's that you're going to have this guy, and ultimately it's going to be through the fact that he endures betrayal after betrayal after betrayal, that as the older brother destroys like is on this destructive path, that the younger, who is the one who's been oppressed, then rejuvenates the whole world, and is ultimately like, him becoming Pharaoh is so perfect because it's at that time that would have been the king of the world. So like Joseph saves the world, right? Not just the descendants of Israel, but he saves the entire world, Jew and Gentile, right? Which is this perfect example of how God plans to save the world. It's your first hint of how the whole world will be blessed, because Abraham fails so much that it's hard to see. And in many ways, I think when you get to Jacob, it's showing just how much of a failure the patriarchs are, and then which is really shown in the fact that all of the kids of Israel are the worst, and especially the older they are, the worse they are.
Right.
So your top guys sleeps with the father's concubine. What's it called? Simeon and Levi. They get that guy circumcised, and while he's recovering, kill him, and like they do, like, and then Judah's the next one in line, and Judah's the one who sells his brother into slavery, right?
Yeah, well, that kind of brings me up a thing that I've been, thinking in as I study these things more, and this is something that has helped to learn more about kind of some of like the Heiser stuff, and just the, looking at those other cultures, is that I think we totally minimize how evil the evil people were, or just people in general, like, and even, like when it talks about, like, when Moses gives them that whole list of like the sexual sins in Leviticus, and like, it's like, do not do as the Canaanites and as the Egyptians do.
Right.
So it's like saying this is all their normal habits. And personally, thinking like, I think they're trying to like crossbreed for giants and stuff, I think with a lot of that. Because that was like a technology that they understood, like agricultural, breeding and stuff, and they were trying to, so but like that's the thing, and I think, even beyond like supernatural things, like, because when people talk about like how they went into Canaan and they just wiped all the people out, and like, how could they do that? And like, these were not people you wanted to have as neighbors. Like, I think that
well, I think the Heiser material really helped me in that as well, because if you're reading it from that perspective, a good chunk of the people were like, the giants that are killed are literally like embodied demons. Right. And a good chunk of the people did, like, we do have the archaeological evidence behind the child sacrifice. We got very, very good evidence for the amount of child sacrifice that was being practiced. And it's kind of funny because it is in some way God intervening in a genocide, and then people now complain that God intervened in that genocide. You know what I mean? It's just like, like I think that there's a lot that can be learned from a lot of those perspectives, and trying to understand what exactly is going on. And also, I'm not convinced that stuff has stopped. I've studied enough of what's his name, Aleister Crowley, to know enough about what he believed sex magic was. To know that he gets quoted by enough people that would be able to practice such things. Right? Like, I don't want to go full-blown conspiracy theory, but how many billionaire pedophiles with pagan temples on their islands do we need before we think that maybe some people are still participating in this deep wickedness? Is 2 enough? Do you need a third? Right? Do you need more than the Mayan pyramid on Peter Nygaard's
Well, just so you know, there is on my channel a video where I called into Alex Jones' show, so you don't have to like.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
I wonder about, like, I don't want to go full-fledged with it because I don't think all of that stuff is legit, but there's definitely enough into it that if you start going into MK Ultra, for instance,
right,
I'm not convinced that we stopped doing ritual practices that could create special abilities in people.
Yeah.
Like, do we have evidence that they have done that relatively recently? Yes. That's not even debated. It's just whether or not you think that has a spiritual element. And look, if you're a non-Christian, you don't think that has a spiritual element. And as Christians, we think everything has a spiritual element. So, not too difficult to do.
Well, I mean, I think I was just thinking about, like, whether it's the devil or demons or, like, like the Deuteronomy 32 kind of like rulers of nations or whatever, thinking like, they're more limited than God. They're not omniscient. They're not omnipresent. But like now we're getting to a technological level where like states and governments are becoming omniscient and omnipresent and stuff. And like, and just to say, like, that's just a thing that people want. Like, nobody wants that. There's something behind the people that wants that.
What would make that even scarier is if these same people told the story of the Tower of Babel, but switched it so that God was the bad guy in it. And so that literally the EU building would look like the Tower of Babel. Have you seen that picture?
I have not, but
okay. Yeah. Well, the image of a pier. Okay, so if you just look it up, EU Parliament building, Tower of Babel, they purposely made it look like it was in the middle of being built, which looks like the most famous painting of the Tower of Babel. This EU, literally all the nations coming together. Why would you flip that story, right? Or it's some of the symbols for God, I think, are literally the opposite of the Christian story. Kind of terrifying. It's even if it's just people. Yeah, did you find it?
Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah.
Isn't that a fun little image, right?
Well, it's just I mean, I think all this stuff's fascinating. That's like, and I think that's it's like, I think
sorry to restructure my point on that. I think it's really important to know that I think that the spiritual influence of human beings are enough that it doesn't need a single demon to be involved for human beings to seek things that are demonic.
Yeah.
I think human beings can seek that in such a terrible way that it doesn't even require interdimensional beings or any, like, it doesn't require demons to get in there for it to go evil. It is kind of strange to me, though, as we're watching these things be unveiled, where why can't they just be messed up? Why do they have to bring in demons into it? Like, why couldn't Peter Nygard and Jeffrey Epstein, why couldn't they just abuse people? Why did they need temples on their islands? Why? Right? That to me is a pretty good question. Like, why did it have to be that? Couldn't it just be messed up? Did you have to bring in worship? Like, and the answer, from us, I think, is yes. You do have to bring in worship to it, especially if you're thinking about it. If it's not just happening, if you're actually creating structures around it, it looks like worship. We don't know how not to do that, right? Anyway. I
Yeah.
feel like I have drifted on a variety of topics, but at the same time, to me, this is illustrations of the exact same ideas. The idea, like, to say that people are still worshiping these evil gods, that still is the story of the empires.
Yeah.
Right. And that the imagery of Babel is still happening to this day. What that is still occurring, right? One of the most famous pictures of God in the US is an image of Babel. It's of the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, and ziggurats were pyramids, okay?
Yeah.
So one of the most popular images of God in the US is a pyramid with light emanating from the top of it, okay? That image is what they used ziggurats for. You meet God at the top of an artificial Eden that you create, okay? They did the image that America picked was not of the temple on Mount Zion, okay? They made a pyramid, okay? That's a different image, right? And at the same time, they created a giant pagan temple, and they put Abraham Lincoln on a throne in there, right? It's the Lincoln Monument is the temple of Zeus, but instead of Zeus on his throne, it's Lincoln, right? So it's weird. These are very religious imagery.
Yeah.
This is like, which is partially why I also think that maybe the new movement of the church is actually in, Pajot talks about this, in its death, not in its reign, but in its death, right? And so things collapsing actually makes me a little bit excited for that reason.
Well, I do think, I think that, from like a spiritual warfare kind of level, like,
right.
The more like decentralized everything, like that's the thing. I think a lot of people can't really get their hands around that, or people always talk about like, oh, there's like all these millions of different like Protestant denominations, and that's so bad. I'm like, it's not. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's not great, but none of them are killing each other. So, there's like, I think I think the Bible is like the thing, like get it to as many people as you can. I think translating it in as many languages as possible, like,
that's right.
Yes, like people will come up with bad and wacky and weird interpretations, but like God's not afraid of that. So I don't think we should should be afraid of it, because that's the thing, is that all of these, like the big churches, Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, whatever, and other, even just other denominations too, they all kind of have this a desire to control, not necessarily that the Bible is being read, but they want to control the interpretation. And even it makes me a little nervous, because I do hear some guys like Heiser and some of the other academics kind of talk, like, seem like they kind of are like I don't know, do you study in Hebrew, or like how much are you like?
Yeah, no, I do most of the stuff in English. I try to bring Hebrew thinking, and I consult the Hebrew on a regular basis. But I do most of my work in English, because the other thing, which is, I don't know, we are New Testament thinkers, right? And so I actually think that part of the interpretive process we can see in the way that it was translated into Greek, and that the church wasn't scared of the Septuagint. And like, I actually think that the translators of the Septuagint are doing things with the text, right? Like, I'll use a quick example. I think that the Hebrew does not say the virgin is with child. I don't think it says that in Isaiah. It says the young woman will be with child, right? And that his name's going to be Emmanuel. And I think that the people who were translating the Septuagint, that they actually looked at that passage They knew that it could be virgin or young woman, and they made the decision. They believed that was a belief that they thought God was going to fulfill it another time in a bigger way. I think that is why they translated it incorrectly, right? It quote unquote incorrectly.
Yeah.
Is that that actually happens in the way that Obadiah is quoted, where Obadiah speaks of the redemption of Edom, and Edom comes from, which is what's Esau, right? Gets called Edom, right? Because he's red. But Edom is also from the same root as Adam. And so the Septuagint translates this to the nations, not Edom individually, but Adam, meaning all mankind. And the New Testament, in quoting that, I think they knew the Hebrew as well.
Yeah.
But I think that they chose to quote from Obadiah, speaking of the redemption of Adam instead of Edom, because they saw that the translator was dealing with something that could look at something bigger, and that the translator of the Septuagint made that decision, and the church decided that is the correct interpretation. And maybe even like this idea that the writing of the text has a bigger picture in mind than even the writers think to themselves, right? Like, well, how much did,
That's what I think. That's the thing. That's why it drives me nuts whenever like the Heiser disciples or whatever will just say like, oh, it can't mean something that it didn't mean back then or whatever. Like, and I just read the Bible, I'm like, but they got it wrong all the time. They never listened to it, you know. Well, like,
and part of the image for me as well is this idea of how do we gather all the strands, which was a big problem that Jacob had, because there's a lot of different messianic images in images of how God saves his people. So one of the most interesting things is that Christ, like, he doesn't like this idea. And within a lot of Jewish thinking, this is the priest figure, this is the king figure, right? This is the Joseph figure, this is right. And the fact that Christ might be able to bring those things together. And that more than that, it couldn't be any other way. Like, the way that I think of it is, by the time of the New Testament, there is no tribe of Joseph. There's no Ephraim, right? So the Ephraim Messiah can't be Ephraim alone. He has to be uniting another messianic image, or being the Ephraim Messiah, well-being of Judah. But then there's a Judah Messiah. So is he able to fulfill that? Or is he going to be from Levi? And then is he also going to be fulfilling the priest imagery as well? What is he going to, like, how is that possible? Because it's not going to work as clean as the Old Testament would imply.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think that's, because that's the thing. So I've just been thinking about this Tower of Babel thing a lot, and learning about languages and stuff. And it seems like, different languages kind of have, like, the way I'm thinking of it in the way that makes sense. I think that the language prior to Babel was probably super efficient at communicating. There was not a lot of misunderstanding between people. And however God, it's not like he made a bunch of, it's not like you just change like the A's to B's and change the B's to C's. Right. Languages are all so different, and they all have strengths and weaknesses. And most languages are like really efficient and great at communicating certain things. And then at other things, they're kind of clunky. And, we kind of, linguists, can see that, like this is like the way I'm like reinterpreting, like this is like the evolutionary story that they want to say about, like, oh, well, the Sumerians came first, and then the Babylonians, and everybody just borrowed from whoever was before. And they do this with like mythology, and they do it with like language too. But I'm more thinking like everybody has this kind of awareness, like we've lost a great deal of knowledge. We've lost a great deal of knowledge about our past and about how we communicate. And so they are just mixing stuff together and trying to figure things out. And, so and some of it's not just this, like the way that like, secular scholars or whatever talk about how like they talk about ancient people like they're so dumb and that they're just always borrowing stuff from their
it
leaders.
is, even as I was going into the Bible story this most recent time, I'm leading a Bible study, and we're going through Genesis. I was looking at a lot, and the group that I'm leading, they all come from non-Christian backgrounds. I wouldn't even say that they are Christian, but have become interested in Genesis and so on. Or I've been leading this group. Either way, that's a whole nother story, but so I won't get into it. But because so many people are interested in how this could relate to other cultures and everything, I was reading a lot of the other stories where no one talks about this part. They see, oh, look at how Genesis 1 parallels with this, and look at how Genesis 2 parallels with this, and there's this First Nation story and all this other stuff. I don't hear a lot of people mentioning that those stories stop being parallel stories after Babel.
Yeah.
Right? Like literally the stories that are everyone's stories are before in the Bible the world is divided.
Right.
So you can find for First Nations Cain and Abel, but you can't find First Nations Abraham. Right? You can't. I'm literally at the part in the text where Abram is switching to Abraham. So I keep on calling Abraham as a result, because that's how I'm speaking with him. And some of the people in the group don't know that his name's going to change. So they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, sorry, Abraham or Abram. Yeah, that's how you know him right now. But so that to me is so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, because that's why I kind of get like, I'm like, it's not that I'm opposed to, like, if I had all the time in the world and I could go back to school, and like I think it would be fascinating to learn Hebrew or whatever, but I don't think that like that's like the Islamic idea that you have to like know Arabic to be able to understand the Quran.
I agree, but what I would say is, if you use like an ESV, you just read the footnotes,
right? Because
if you read the footnotes a lot, you will have an introduction to the language where you will know that anytime, like there's like a list of words that I think are crucial to know, because if you know those words, then every single time you hear, like if you know that angel and messenger are the same word, then there's like weird parallelism that the text will be doing. If you know that the word wind, spirit, and breath is one word, you're going to see parallels where you wouldn't have seen them before, right? It's not a coincidence that they hear the sound of a rushing wind before the Spirit of the Lord descends, right? The coming alive by the Spirit, that's like, it's an image of like breath, of being alive the way that you're only alive because you're breathing, right? Like those images are remarkably helpful. I am not, despite the fact that I love Hebrew, I am not so obsessed with one language that I would do that. And I do think that the New Testament actually instructs us in the way that it quotes translations, not just that it quotes the Septuagint, but that it also quotes the Targums. We can see that they are actually trying to get at ideas that they knew were being hit on by the people that translated. Right? Yeah. So like, do you think it is a coincidence that that the cry of faith for the New Testament is that Christ is Lord, and that Lord is how you translate Yahweh in the Old Testament? Right? So if you take a line, for instance, and you think of it as Hebrew thinkers, that you are to baptize people in it, like in the name of the Lord, or just like what the Lord like when speaking of Jesus as the Lord, right? Now, it's not as direct. Sometimes it's just master language, but those line up. And that Christ is also referred to. So that's how the Greek translated it. Well, the Aramaic translated it as the word, right? Repeatedly, it used the word memra in the Targums, which is the Aramaic translations of the text. And when they translate it, they are saying, like, they refer to specifically Yahweh when Yahweh is acting in an embodied and salvific way. They will say the word of God, right? Once you know that, it's just like all this stuff about Greek philosophy influencing John 1, John 1:1. I'm like, no, it's not. Maybe there's a little bit of Greek philosophy, but that to me is Hebraic thinking, that you would refer to him as the word.
Well, then it's almost, it can go the other way, because then then the Greeks can understand. They can understand it in their, because that's the thing that's so fascinating to me, is this kind of battle idea, and that God gave every language like these different little strengths and weaknesses, and it's not total, like we can communicate with each other with people that speak other languages, but like your native language does influence the way you think. And so like as the Bible is translated into other languages, like native speakers of those languages are seeing things, and we could say like that's not exactly what it means, but I do think that history is kind of God's the God of languages. He's the one that split them up, and he's the one that can put them back together. So because I just think like different theological things have developed because of that. Like like the Catholics study mostly in Latin, the Orthodox are studying in Greek. After the Reformation, you have people studying in German and English, and each of those did bring it through the translation process and the study. Like you can't say that wasn't in there, but it almost does reveal things.
It's so interesting, because what the Catholics wanted to do was to have a universal language. Yeah, that was part of the function with Latin, is that if you visited Rome, there wasn't, like, if you visit Rome now, there'll be like 5 masses in a row, and one will be in Italian, one will be in French, one will be in English or whatever, right? Whereas the idea was, if we had it like Latin, meant it was a universal language. And to me, it's like, what if there is something that God is intending to do in the splitting up of languages, that plays not just a role in the fall, but that this idea of redemptive death, right? That it's not just all destruction, right? But that God actually uses the destruction to bring about new life. Is again why, even with all the falls that happen in Genesis, the spiraling down, to me that begs a question. And the question is, could God be so good and so sovereign that he is able to use the things that are against him for the redemptive story? Could he do that, right? And that to me is Abel to Joseph, right? Is the other brothers are Cain, right? And the world is Cain. And so even this obsession with creating the good empire, right, to spread across the world, is the fact that we don't believe that God could, through his sovereignty, accomplish all good things through this, right? And one of the things that I think is a funny thing that was lost is that there's no more Calvinist pacifists. Is I think this is kind of funny, because I've spent a lot of time with the Mennonites, And the Mennonites get a bad rap as being like, because they're Anabaptists, that they don't believe in sovereignty, right? Like they don't believe that God's really sovereign because they think that they like their choices play a role. Do you know how, like I've spent time with the Amish and stuff too. Do you know how conservative Mennonites choose a pastor? As someone who comes from a reform background, this will be crazy to you. Do you know it?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so when you become baptized as a man, these are conservatives, right? As a man, you say that if you are called to lead, you will lead. Okay, so every single man has to be willing to be a pastor if they're going to become a Christian, which is interesting as well. And then let's just say one of you need another pastor, or a pastor is retired or died or whatever. How do you choose a new pastor? Well, all of the members, baptized members, vote on the men who they think are good leaders and say, I think that person is called. Okay. They go up to those men and say, is there any reason why you can't serve? You have to have a very good reason to not be. Might be, my wife is in the middle of, we're just about to have another kid, and I think there's going to be problems with that, or we're taking care of our in-laws, and so our workload is whatever, or I'm struggling with whatever. You step down. Then you take all those guys who said, yes, I can serve. You gather them all together, you pray, and then you put their names in a hat, and then whatever name that God chooses is the name that comes out of the hat. Those are the people that, quote unquote, don't believe that God is sovereign. And with their ideas about how the empires of the world work. It's not that they don't think that God is using wars in order to accomplish his goals. It's just the belief that it's not our place to be involved in those wars. And whether or not we take up arms, God is still in control of all of it, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting to me that there's no reform guys who are pacifists. Like, that's actually kind of funny to me, because it's just like, you have the theological bedrock to very easily believe in this idea that I'm putting forward, which is we believe that we have to do to accomplish this thing. And the image of Genesis is that the doer, the word for doing or making is Cain. That's what that word is, right? It's sometimes translated as smith in other languages, but Eve says, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And that word that she uses, gotten or make, she's saying I've become a co-creator with God, which is a beautiful image. But to me, Cain is a symbol of law, of action, of doing. And doing is failure, right? It requires grace of God, of him getting involved, which is the greatest symbol of, is in the Old Testament, is Joseph. That, like, wait a second, could this possibly be used to redeem the whole world, right? And in that, you can also, as Christians, we see the cross, right? Is that the devil gets involved in the story, right? The devil and human wickedness, and it's a joint effort of both Jews and Gentiles, right? Like, in any action, you have the thought, the evil thought, and the evil action, and that is embodied through the two joining together to do it, right? One has the action, but doesn't know why they're doing it. The other knows why they're doing it, but doesn't do it, right? And that they join together, Jew and Gentile, join together to show the weakness of humanity and the work of the devil in the world. But that God's incredible grace is that he literally was able to unify Satan, the Gentiles, and the Jews into one action that would redeem the world. Like, that to me it's not a guy who did everything he could to get everything right. I mean, yes, Jesus is the person who does do that, but it's not in all of this, like, it's not 30 people, 30 good people that accomplish this.
Yeah.
It's one good man and everyone else being corrupted that God's sovereignty works in the midst of.
Yeah, and that was something that, like, that kind of whole, that was like a mind-blowing thing where I kind of figured that out through some of Heiser's stuff, like, especially because when Jacob was saying, like, why isn't there just like one verse that says like God's going to send his son or something, and it's like,
right.
It was this thing where, you know, we're not the only ones that are reading these scriptures, like, which that's why I kind of got into this whole meta thing of like, how is the devil, like, you know, because the devil or whatever he is, he's trying to figure out what God's plan is. That's why there's all those genocides of, like, you know, the babies and Moses, like, he's trying to crush that, he's trying to kill that seed, seed. And then, you know, the things that were obscure, when you're trying to predict, everybody was looking for the wrong things, everybody was looking for the conquering king, but then after the cross, it's all like, whoa, like,
how could it be anything else?
Yeah, everything makes sense, but you couldn't have predicted the way that it would be fulfilled. So that's why it makes me think, like, this kind of whole weird thing about, like, the devil is, he's not gonna encourage Satanists to read the Bible because they'll probably become saved. So instead he gets like, he gets Christians to become obsessed with like Revelation, and then he can like have them come up with a bunch of weird theories, and then even if it's not to figure out what actually happens, then you know, you can make things that get people freaked out because it looks like what they're predicting.
I agree with a good chunk of what you're saying, but as I'm like, after that conversation with Jacob, I'm going back into Genesis and asking this question about incarnation. And I think, first off, the first time that God's image, spirit, is present in a human being, it's one human being. It is not two. Because part of Jacob's point was, well, God can't be expressed in one image. That's why it's man and woman that are the image of God. But in Genesis 2, it's first just Adam, right? It's just one person.
Well, yeah.
But the other thing that I've been thinking is, if you just had Genesis, the idea, and other Hebraic thinkers thought this, the idea that God could actually become a person is everywhere, right? God primarily appears in Genesis as an embodied human being. That is primarily how he interacts with people, right? And this can be shown to be so ridiculous that no modern Orthodox Jew would ever have an encounter like Jacob has and come away with it thinking they had an encounter with God. Mm-hmm. Like, if God appeared the way that he appears in Genesis, they would say that can't be God. That's not the way God works, right? Like, they would say, no. Like, it can't be that, right? It needs to be, like, the idea would be through a voice and through a bunch of other stuff. But the way that God interacts with people primarily, if God wants to convince us that he can't become a human being, then he's doing a really bad job of it in Genesis.
Yeah.
Right? In Genesis, he repeatedly is doing a terrible job of letting us know that he's not a man.
Fig leaves wouldn't hide you from an all-seeing, omniscient being, but it would work for somebody who you're walking in the garden with, or,
who you see as literally embodied, and that future people see as literally embodied as well. Embodied enough, and not just, they don't think of him as like a spirit, right? They don't even think of him in that way, because you can't eat with a spirit. You can't wrestle with a spirit, right? And it's not just in one book. In Exodus, they go up and they sit down and have a meal with God again, right? This imagery, but like there is an issue with that later biblical authors are dealing with, which is, in my opinion, the image of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, which is the imagery that Revelation uses, and also why Christ refers to himself as the Son of Man. But it's not just that he says that he's the Son of Man. In all of the Gospels, he says, I am the Son of God, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And the one on the clouds is God, right? In both the Old Testament and in every other source that we have that uses that image. Yeah. So if that is not actually an image of God, then it's a ridiculous exception that would have deeply confused people, and which is why, like, Jacob kind of passed it by, but writers of, like, people who had these conversations in the Talmud, the guy who is one of the main composers of the Mishnah, which is, this is Jewish tradition. If you don't understand it, it's fine. But major people within Jewish thinking, hundreds of years later, were still being like, yeah, that's like a divine person. How does that divine person work? Right? Now, most Jews don't think of, I mean, it's difficult to say most Jews about anything, but that passage is, let's just say, under-examined within a lot of streams of Judaism.
Yeah. That was,
Anyway, sorry. Was there any other ideas from the first conversation that you wanted to talk a bit about before I say goodbye to you?
Well, I mean, we kind of was originally thinking, like, the more talk about, like, the Passover stuff, and you know, I mean, you'd said there are more, like, resources or whatever to figure that out, because I think that, as a, like, my wife is partially Jewish, so it is, like, for my kids, it's part of their heritage. So her grandparents were actually, one was Greek Orthodox, her grandfather was Greek Orthodox, and her grandmother was Jewish. And then when they got married, they both decided they'd just go to the Baptist church instead. So, like,
that you make a compromise so that no one's happy. Yeah, that'll be the best way. That's good. That's good.
So, because I mean, I feel a little bit weird about kind of like the Christians that, like, appropriate all of the Jewish, like, and not, I mean, it is part of our heritage, but it's also, like, it's part of our heritage spiritually, but you feel weird because it's not part of your, like, cultural heritage.
And it takes a really long time to sort through the traditions too, because traditions it's not as easy, because it's not one thing. It's not do these things, right? It's like, but then the Sephardic Jews do it this way, and Ashkenazi do it that way, whatever, right? So I do think, so it might be good for us to have a follow-up conversation, and maybe even email correspondence about it. I think that the early church did celebrate these feasts. How we understand that, I think requires a lot of work, but ultimately what comes out of it is joy and celebration. Is that, like, I went to a Messianic synagogue for Yom Kippur a couple of years, and they broke fast together as a church. And Yom Kippur is known by Jews as a very, very guilty day, right? And you get, like, a lot of synagogues will have walls that, like, are closed off, that they have to open up, because most weeks synagogue has barely any people in it. And then for Yom Kippur, it is, like, flooded with people, right? As this is the day where atonement is being made. But, like, it's just, what comes out of it is guilt upon guilt upon guilt, right? Where that becomes it becomes a cultural aspect of Judaism, is Jewish guilt, right? That's an idea. And it's very interesting that, to me, Catholicism is also known as guilt, like as Catholic guilt, right? And so I celebrated Yom Kippur with a bunch of Messianic Jews, and they could not contain their elation because we are asking God for forgiveness, and we know He's going to give it to us. And so it became, it was, you know, we had solemn focus and prayer, but there wasn't, you know, and there was multiple people who grew up Orthodox Jewish within that community that were sharing their own stories of how guilty they would feel and what that felt like to be going through these rituals and not believing that they were good enough to receive God's forgiveness. And then you have them at this Messianic synagogue just breaking fast together, celebrating that they've been forgiven. Like, it was very, very powerful. And to me, that its selling point is not merely we should do these traditions because they're cool. Okay. Judaism has been accused of many things. It being cool is not one of them. Okay. Like, it's one of the things when I was attending this one Messianic church, I loved it because the worship was so lame, because it was like Christianized klezmer music. Like, if you know what klezmer is, it's like a lot of violin and clarinet and like it was. And the guy who was leading this Jewish Christian guy was just very lanky, very nerdy looking. He was not the cool Pentecostal bass player, right? No one in that worship band was getting laid out of this, okay? Whereas, like, you know, Christian youth group, some of the youth group things are like so cool. You don't do these things because they're cool. It's that as you get into these patterns, you see that this is literally the pattern that God gave us so that we could see what He was doing. It's why, to me, it's God gives us the feasts first so we would understand what Christ is doing, right? And so I'd love to have future conversations with you, maybe even just email correspondence of walking you through Passover, because part of why you celebrate it is that it's a good time. And part of why you celebrate it is it helps you understand what God has done for you. And it helps you understand what God has done throughout all of history. Because again, it's the past, it's Christ in the past, it's us right now. It's like, as you are seeing a universal story, it is speaking right into that. And again, I've only really gotten into Passover. I haven't been able to get into Yom Kippur, which is everywhere in biblical thinking, in biblical conversation, is Yom Kippur. And also, I think that when you know about how they speak of the temple, it seems pretty obvious to me that these things are all written before the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
Because some of the things that they're talking about makes no sense if the temple is not around, if it's been destroyed. So anyway,
all right, well, yeah, we definitely can follow up in some form or whatever, because that was but it was a really good conversation. And I like, you know, I can tell we're kind of kindred spirits in a lot of ways, thinking along a lot of the same kind of ways. So
there's a lot of new material that we can get to, which I'm excited about what I think is the next thing. And the next thing is not, I think you might really appreciate this in your view of, you break everything down. In Passover, it's not led by a religious leader at all. It's within families. Right. And I did a lot of study in Judges. And to me, Judges is setting up this thing that people don't want to be a father, they want a king. Because Joshua basically sets it up as this idea of like, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And this image that those households, and that what God gives them is mostly how to celebrate in households, right? Not how to celebrate, like only certain people would be walking distance from the temple, right? Like, so it's not, even though the temple becomes central to certain traditions and people were called to visit the city at certain points, the pilgrim feasts, there was a way to celebrate wherever you were. And those would be led not by rabbis, not by local Levites, but by the fathers of the households, right? I think in getting into these Jewish traditions, we also see an image of this decentralization.
Yeah.
Which is, again, this idea of like, well, who is right, the Catholics or the Orthodox? Well, both of them require priests. So,
yeah,
right, like,
yeah, that's because, and that's kind of like, that was the thing that originally, when I first got in contact with you, because, I've kind of been thinking like, I love the evangelical church. There's still lots of great people in those evangelical churches.
Absolutely.
And so we are lacking like ritual, and there is that's something that I've learned, that that is something that's good about these other traditions, but you're not going to convince a lot of evangelical people to become part of an institution for the rituals.
And the problem is all the rituals that are proposed, why?
Yeah.
Why? Because if we even admit, like, as we understand where some of these traditions come from, it's like, oh, okay, so God can redeem paganism.
Yeah.
But then God can redeem anything, so that's not an argument to do it.
Right.
Right? Just because God redeemed it, like, that's fine, whatever, right? Like, it's not an argument for it to be used above other things. But this, I actually think the argument for its supremacy is that it was given to us by God for the very purpose of why we use traditions.
Yeah.
To embody what he has done for his people.
Yeah. Right? And it's clearly, it predates all of the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. So, yeah.
And that these things overlap, to me, is also, I believe these are prophecies that are not used. Christians don't understand Passover well enough to understand that's Christ, right? Or they see it on the most surface level.
Yeah.
Most Christians don't know that Pentecost is an Old Testament feast, and that when you understand it, that's why they were all meeting on Pentecost. And that's also like helps you understand what the Holy Spirit is doing in the way that the biblical authors are speaking about it, right? They don't understand it because they don't understand the traditions. And that to me is also, because this is just happening now, this is central to biblical theology that we have not been practicing for the majority of the church's life. So that to me is also the getting back to what it was. It's so interesting because as you read the Bible, the temple is barely functioning for Israel's history.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like the idea that it will be one place is right there from Exodus, and it doesn't happen until what's it called? First Kings? Like not until like David brings it in, but it's not even really until Solomon that it's really enacted. And the corruption is almost immediately. David's kingship as well, it's so interesting because these things are lost almost immediately. The priesthood is lost so quickly. The kingship is lost so quickly. So it actually follows this pattern that what communion would be lost so quickly. And so to be in this period of time where we're rediscovering what was always the case is, if it is not the culmination, is what the culmination will be like. Yeah. The culmination will be like this time where we remember.
And that follows the pattern from before, because the second temple was much more successful than the first temple in the faithfulness of the people doing it, you know.
Well, but at the same time, the second temple does not have the major artifact.
Yeah, right.
So even that idea of Second Temple Judaism, there's no Ark of the Covenant, right? So to be able to lose something like that is so incredible, because it is the symbol of God ruling Israel, is that his throne is there. And that's the Ark of the Covenant, right? It's the idea that God is working among failure, I think, is very, very present. I don't think that's a Christian invention. Mm-hmm. I think it is, I think when people read the covenant, they need to remember that God actually states in Deuteronomy what will happen if they don't follow the covenant, and that is, those consequences are present to this day. And that God's ultimate plan in dispersing the Jewish people was to call them back, but also that the church in its failure has spread out. And again, that their death might actually be the thing that brings about the redemption, the resurrection, that it comes on the other side of death. People are scared of that because that's nothing we do, right? That requires God's sovereignty for it to be accomplished. So, I mean, I would rather be, no, that's not true. I wouldn't want to cheat on my wife and whatnot. It's a question that people have to ask. Do you want to be later David, or do you want to be early David? Because early David is not the everything goes his way kind of a guy. That's not what it's like for early David. He is chosen for the same reason Israel is chosen. In Deuteronomy, it says, I chose you because you were the least of the nations. And David gets chosen as the least, right? And Joseph is the least. And it's to be able to see that, to be, I think, redefining what Christ looks like to look like what it's always been. And it's interesting because even the idea of the Davidic Messiah has been our obsession, not the Joseph Messiah. And so what was the church trying to be? It was trying to be David. That's not good.
Yeah.
Right? And not by our effort was the Dead Sea Scrolls found, right? It was just guy throwing a rock, it's random, nobody uncovers it. That's what it looks like, right? It's not by our effort that these things come together.
Yeah. No coincidences.
No, yeah. Okay, so let's talk again some other time. This was a good conversation.
Yeah.
If Jacob is watching, I want him to know that I do think he won that conversation. I think maybe on purpose, because I tried to be as open as possible.
Yeah.
And use him as a resource to push against me. So I don't agree with him. But if it makes you feel any better, Jacob, I think you won that conversation. But I'm really glad that I got to have this conversation with you, and I hope it's encouraged you, and we'll talk soon. Yeah.
Sounds good. All right, thanks.
Okay, bye.